Welcome again to Book and Adaptation, wherein I review a book and critique its subsequent film adaptation. Today we're talking about Into the Wild by Jon Krakauer, and I really don't want to, and I'll tell you why. First off, I think I'm getting sick. Secondly, I'm exhausted from and possibly injured by 4 hours of rehearsing acrobatics with my circus troupe. And thirdly, I really don't like Christopher McCandless. That last bit is particularly unfortunate because Into the Wild is basically the biography of Christopher McCandless, so that's kind of a problem. So I should warn you up front that this video isn't going to be one of my best as far as thoroughness and detail are concerned, because I watched this movie like 4 months ago and then it took me forever to read the book because I disliked McCandless so much. So I can't remember all the details from the movie that I would normally like to cover, and the book is sort of fuzzy, having read it so sporadically and begrudgingly. I just want to get this experience over with, so I'm not going to go back and rewatch the movie or reread the book. I'm just going to go with what struck me most and therefore what I remember best. I'm not actually going to use the phrase half-assed. So anyway, the book was written by Jon Krakauer, who is an accomplished outdoorsness-related writer and journalist. He's most well known for another nonfiction novel called Into Thin Air, which is about mountaineering. It includes experiences of his own and of other people in climbing Mount Everest. It was published a year after Into the Wild, and it's still his most popular work, though it didn't get a film adaptation. It just got a made-for-TV movie, which doesn't count for anything. So originally, this was a 9,000-word article that Krakauer wrote for The Outdoor magazine, which he later expanded into this book, Into the Wild. It still has the tag on it. The original article and most of this book concerns a young man named Christopher McCandless. He graduated top of his class at Emory University and then gave away all his worldly possessions, including about $25,000 in savings to charity, to go on Walkabout, or the American hitchhiking equivalent, only to be found dead in the Alaskan wilderness 4 months later. There's no spoilers there. He dies alone in the end, we know this. It's kind of like Titanic, and I think it's why some people didn't want to watch the movie, but that's later. Actually, it is a little bit backwards to be talking about this one in the usual book adaptation movie order, because the problem for me was the difference between the actual person Christopher McCandless and the fictional character Christopher McCandless as written by Sean Penn, who did the adaptation. I found the fictional McCandless to be a lot more likable and a more sympathetic character than the McCandless described in the book, in my opinion. To be fair, I think part of this problem is because the biography has so many gaps for all the time McCandless spent in the wild actively trying to avoid people. Krakauer did a lot of research here, finding people across the country who McCandless had interacted with during those 4 months. Like, people who picked him up hitching or gave him work or whatever. Trying to figure out a timeline and a chronological map for his travels. So to take that amount of limited information and turn it into a story for a film, Penn had to fill in a lot of those gaps with actual character development, and his McCandless was less of a jerk, in my opinion. To me, this book described a young man who had this great belief that he needed to eschew all trappings of modern society and civilization. He took, in his words, or me paraphrasing, the simpler path, a much more natural state of being through untainted wilderness and not living off all of the processed crap of modern civilization. Yeah, that's definitely me paraphrasing. If my hands do this, that's not a direct quote. Ah, screw it. I think this is an interesting choice to make as a lifestyle, because I can definitely relate to wanting things to be less complicated and better for the environment. But as far as actually leaving this kind of lifestyle to go off into the wilderness, I have a computer, and a cell phone, and an iPad, and a car, and indoor plumbing. I don't even go camping. Call me soft and spoiled, but I need these kinds of trappings of everyday life. Upper middle class everyday life. Primarily the indoor plumbing. And believe me, I know I've got it really good, and I'm thankful for every bit of it, and that might be one reason why McCandless bothers me so much. In the book, he's so frequently described by the people he comes across in his travels as having this holier-than-thou attitude about his view of the world, like he had it right and everybody else is just living wrong. I think maybe some of what annoys me is that I kind of agree with him. I have a lot of crap that I don't actually need in terms of the food, water, shelter, most basic of survival needs. I don't need an iPad, I just like to play silly games on it. So I can understand some of his thinking there, but to take it to the extreme that he did and then expect to hold everyone else to the same standard seems a little inappropriate to me. Especially because he did have it that good. He was given the same luxuries and opportunities by his family, and he spit on it. It wasn't that he just disagreed with the lifestyle and chose to give it up, which I think is a fairly noble goal, like giving his savings to charity, but as far as I can tell he didn't acknowledge or respect the fact that his parents had provided well for him as best they knew how, even if it was different from his own beliefs. Admittedly, this all comes from interviews Krakauer had with the parents, so it's a fairly one-sided account. Aside from some conversations with McCandless's sister Corinne, with whom he was very close. He admitted to her the disdain and disrespect he felt for his parents, that he broke ties with the family to go off on this trip. This was still hard because he was so close with Corinne, but he did keep in contact with her through a few letters, primarily at the beginning of the trip, which is more hitchhiking than wilderness-ing. So, Krakauer talks about McCandless and his reasons for leaving, but this book isn't quite a biography because it covers a lot of similar stories, though to a lesser degree, about other people who did the same thing, going out to live in the wilderness and live off the land. Sadly, most of these anecdotes ended similarly in death. So that makes this book more of an exploration of the concept of the need to go into the wild, rather than a specific biography, though it does primarily focus on McCandless. For McCandless's part in the book, Krakauer didn't approach it at all chronologically, which was annoying and difficult to keep track of, but that might just be me because I was reading it in such small segments over such a long period of time. I don't remember in particular how the book ends, but some of the structure that I liked was using other wilderness-related literary works, think Jack London, to introduce each chapter. Frequently, these came from copies of books that McCandless actually had in his possession when he died, and they occasionally included some annotations that gave a little more insight to his thinking. There was also a fairly modest journal found in his things, very brief one-line entries, which gave a more solid timeline once McCandless reached Alaska, which was a lot more interesting. I don't know. It's a well-written book. It's got all kinds of information based on a pretty impressive amount of research, which I can appreciate. I just don't like the subject of the biography part. I don't know that I could give a fair review given that bias. And that bias, as a good segue, was related to seeing the film first. Another quick disclaimer, I saw this movie 5 months ago. 4 or 5 months ago. So I'm doing the best I can to remember things accurately. Or at all. I was actually quite surprised to learn that Sean Penn had done the adaptation, he also directed, because I was unaware he had done any work as a screenwriter. I thought this was an interesting project to take on in general, because such a large chunk of it is McCandless on his own. That makes a story of just one character with no one to interact with. At times he's talking to himself, or in making those brief journal notes. The adaptation makes good use of that actual journal and excerpts from it as voiceover. The only actual narration of this film came from Jenna Malone's character, his sister. She gives a lot of backstory from their childhood and some of the things that drove McCandless apart from his family. I kind of skipped over the cast here. Emile Hirsch plays Alex, which is Christopher McCandless's name that he took on while traveling. I didn't cover that either. He renamed himself as part of leaving everything of his old life behind. Yeah, I think he did very well in this film. Especially since he had to carry a lot of it as being just a central character on his own for a good chunk of the time. And being a story about one person on his own for a big chunk of the time, this film has a pretty extensive supporting cast. Penn took many of the anecdotes from the book and expanded them into larger, richer story arcs, and we get a lot of great characters built on their real-life counterparts. Marcia Gay Harden and William Hurt play McCandless's parents, and Jenna Malone, as I said, is his sister. Then you have Catherine Keener and Vince Vaughn, Hal Holbrook, Zach Galifianakis has a bit part, and then unfortunately Kristen Stewart has a part that eats up an awful lot of screen time. Personally, I've always had kind of a beef with Kristen Stewart, even prior to the Twilight debacle, because she has these creepy, soulless, dead eyes, and she doesn't really act so much as she occasionally reacts to other stimuli on screen at the time. It was pretty much the same for this movie. As far as I can remember, she didn't exist in the book. Don't quote me on that. Don't quote me on anything from this video. And in the film, she's this weird sort of love non-interest for Alex because he doesn't want anything to do with her, which seems much more plausible to me in general. Dead eyes! Okay, this is me coming back to do reshoots because I realized while editing the video that I had left out the most important supporting character. So, sorry for any differences in the framing, or the lighting, or the sound, or costuming. Anyway, Hal Holbrook plays the character of Ron Franz, who spent the most time with Alex during the 4 months he spent traveling. Alex actually met with Franz several times, at least more than twice, I think. which was rare for Alex to actually make contact with society again. So Franz was in his 80s when he met Alex, but they ended up sharing a really strong bond, and Franz actually wanted to adopt Alex as his grandson, but he never got the chance. What's most interesting about Franz's character is that he's based on the man of the same name from the book. It was an alias Krakauer gave him to protect his privacy. Real-life Franz actually contacted Krakauer after the original article was published, identifying himself as someone Alex had met in his travels, and then turned out to be a large contributor to Krakauer's research, having spent the most time with Alex. I'm really tired. Anyway, it's all sort of a meandering story. Like the book, it doesn't really follow a chronological order. As an adaptation, I was impressed that Penn could take this kind of book and make it a functional story for film. I would say it's a good adaptation for that alone. It's not really lacking anything that needs to be there, because I think this is an instance where the adaptation needed to build a great deal from the source material, as opposed to paring down a larger work. Look at the size of this! For the same reason, it's not a very faithful adaptation, because some was changed and a lot was added, but I'd still say it was well done. Unfortunately, the movie in general was unremarkable enough that I don't remember it that well. I liked it well enough, I guess, but I don't feel the need to ever see it again. Rewatchability is a pretty important quality of movies, in my opinion, and this just did not have it. So really, this whole video is just wishy-washy as far as actually giving a review or suggestion is concerned. I critiqued the hell out of the book, by which I mean I bitched about it, but never gave a yes-no definitive answer on reading it. And then I failed to do it for the movie either. Fine. Read it, watch it. Both the movie and the book get great reviews from other people. This is just me, tired and sick. Go in knowing that the book is not a biography in the traditional sense. It covers a lot of other people and a lot of other stories. Go into the movie knowing there's no surprises. He dies in the end. I would liken it to a series of short stories that are about the same character but unrelated scenes in his life. Not really a lot of overarching plot. Guy runs away from home, guy ends up dead in Alaska. And Kristen Stewart is in it. Tune in next time for Drive. See, it has legitimate uses.